taken her power away from her. It is now many years later, and I absolutely see what they were talking about.
After 4 years of karate kicks, DC agreed with Gloria Steinem and gave Wonder Woman back her powers and her costume.
So, not one of the more glorious chapters in my comic book career.
O'Neill had better luck with another legend whose sales were slipping, Batman. DC editor Julius Schwartz wanted to erase the stain of the campy TV show and get back to the 1939 roots of the character.
As a loner who never showed his face in the light, was the way I remembered those early Bill Finger, Bob Kane stories.
Schwartz teamed O'Neill with artist Neil Adams, who brought a dynamic new realism to superheroes.
Neil once said if superheroes existed, they would have to look the way I draw them, and I think that's absolutely right.
The Batman of the late 60s and early 70s was a fearsome creature of the night for the first time in 30 years. O'Neill and Adams had saved the character from the clutches of camp, but their next resurrection job would involve more than stylistic change. O'Neill and Adams were about to bring social commentary to comics in a radical new way. DC editor Julius Schwartz thought putting more messages in the adventures of Green Lantern might save the book from cancellation.
So let's try it. Let's see if we can start using as a springboard what's happening in the newspapers.
Green Lantern was a hero with a lot of power but no personality. A test pilot inducted in a cosmic police force. He used his power ring to fight supervillains and creatures from outer space.
I had thought of Green Lantern as an enforcer of the status quo. So we needed a contrast with that. Green Arrow is a character dating back to the 40s, never had his own title, had appeared in anthology books, and was kind of a Batman with a bow and arrow. But he was really bland, so we made him the voice of the streets, the voice of the left.
In early 1970, Green Lantern Green Arrow number 76 hit newsstands like a Molotov cocktail. It was openly liberal, even radical. Green Arrow tells readers that a moral cancer is rotting America's soul. The well-meaning Green Lantern is accused of being a racist.
What I remember putting in the script was asking Neil to draw the best face he had ever drawn of a black guy who had been through hell. And he did it. And he starts to say something about, well, I hear you've been helping the blue skins and the green skins on these other planets.
You've done a lot for the purple skins. What have you done for the black skins? It's one of the most reprinted panels in comics history. When you look back at it, well, what's so radical about this? But at the time, it was an outrageous proposition.
My theory was that it was probably too late for my generation. But maybe you get a real smart 12-year-old and get him thinking about racism.
Green Lantern Green Arrow was self-consciously relevant. It tackled religion, race, pollution, and Native American rights. But there were some things that even relevant comics steered clear of. One, incredibly, was the major news story of the time, Vietnam. In the early 60s, some characters were featured in Vietnam-themed storylines. But when the war and the protests at home were raging in the late 60s and early 70s, Vietnam was generally avoided.
I think that generally there was a feeling that that was a scary topic.
Letters would come in from fans saying, hey, how come Captain America doesn't go to Vietnam like and fight the commies there, and like he did the Nazis in World War II?
Marvel heroes had fought the commies in the early 60s, but by the end of the decade, Cold War attitudes didn't seem relevant.
After a while, I think we weren't that sure that the communists were the greatest evil in the world. I tried to avoid stories about the war. The Vietnam War, to me, was too tragic a thing.
By the time we got the courage to do material about Vietnam, I think the war was pretty much over.
The other untouched issue of the period was drugs, until, ironically, the Nixon administration forced the issue in 1971.
I had received a letter from the government, from the Office of Health, Education, and Welfare. They thought it would really be beneficial if I would get a story about the dangers of drug addiction and featured in one of our top books.
Lee and artists Gil Kane and John Romita worked out a 3-issue story arc in which Spider-Man fought the Green Goblin. In a subplot, Spider-Man saves an inner-city kid so stoned he thinks he can fly.
I know nothing about drugs, so I didn't mention what he overdosed on. I didn't know.
Later, Spider-Man's friend Harry, the Green Goblin's son, gets hooked on pills and suffers a near-fatal overdose.
The reader didn't feel we were giving him a lecture. It was just an incident in a story, which I feel is the best way to do it.
Only one problem. The Comics Code Authority didn't want Lee to do it at all.
Rejected. We could not put the seal of approval on those issues. I said, why? They said, according to the code, you're not allowed to mention drugs. I said, but we're not telling the kids to take drugs. The whole purpose of this is to show the danger of drug addiction. Doesn't matter, you're not allowed to mention drugs.
At an impasse, Lee turned to his publisher, Martin Goodman, for support.
I said, Martin, I want to do these books anyway, so we won't have the seal of approval. I was so proud of him. He backed me to the hilt. He said, absolutely, Stan, just let's send him out.
For 3 months, Marvel published Spider-Man without the code's approval.
The world didn't end, the sky didn't fall. We had the greatest write-ups.
My father came home and he said, you know, you have to go pick up this thing called Spider-Man. And I'm like, why? Of course, what he didn't realize at the time was that he started a whole new addiction, which was comic books. So, you know, coincidentally, I never used drugs, but boy, I collected comic books like crazy.
Thanks to the controversy, the Comics Code was liberalized. A few months later, when DC published a much stronger drug story, with Green Arrow's former kid sidekick Speedy as an out-and-out heroin addict, it not only got the seal of approval, but New York Mayor John Lindsay wrote a letter of commendation. But good intentions didn't translate into sales. 2 issues later, Green Lantern Green Arrow was canceled. Relevancy had run its course. But when it came to the first superhero, his durability was proven once again. Over the years, many different writers and artists had redefined Superman. The character had survived because he could be reinterpreted to reflect the times. The 1978 motion picture starring Christopher Reeve kept the basics of the legend and added a late 70s edge of sex and romance.
First Superman is wonderful. It's a really great origin story. If you like the comics, I think Part 2 appeals to you even more because, you know, he's fighting superpowered villains.
3 years before Superman the movie hit theaters, the project would prove to be a milestone for Superman's creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. In the 1940s, they had sued DC over royalties and the rights to Superman, and lost. Now, artist Neil Adams took up their cause. Using the publicity surrounding the upcoming movie, he pressured DC to make amends. In 1975, Siegel and Shuster got a modest lifetime pension and a restored byline on Superman. But DC kept the rights. The first 2 Superman movies were huge box office successes, and Superman's value as a licensed product was reconfirmed. But he was no longer the most popular hero in comic books. Readers' tastes were once again changing, or perhaps mutating. The new hot heroes, the X-Men, didn't always deal with specific political issues, but they were relevant in a broader sense.
The X-Men are very relevant because above and beyond everything else, it's a story of bigotry, of these people who are hated because they're different, even though they're good. And they're trying to help the world. I mean, there's almost a little bit of a Jesus Christ feeling in there.
The X-Men are sort of the most consciously, deliberately, and successfully metaphorical of any comic book superhero.
The X-Men are a team of teenage mutants, each born with a superpower that manifests around puberty.
More mutants are starting to get born. The fear grows even more amongst normal human beings that they will take over the earth.
Growing up in Israel, I understood the metaphor. It was about the right to live and the right to exist.
If you're African American growing up reading comic books, you could relate to the X-Men. If you were gay growing up reading comic books, you could relate to the X-Men. If you were merely just a geek, a nerd being picked on, you could relate to the X-Men.